What's the gospel? Put it in a sentence. The gospel is the news that Jesus Christ, the righteous one, died for our sins, rose again, eternally triumphant over all his enemies, so that there is now no condemnation for those who believe, but only everlasting joy. That's the gospel.
Hello guys, and welcome once again to the Pulse Podcast. This is where we tackle pulse-racing questions regarding the Christian faith. My name is Toya Akinoso. I'm your host. I'm joined, like always, with Mike Omani. Today's question is a very important one. It's one which I'm sure you've probably thought about before, maybe even asked, or maybe even looked at yourself. And it's the question, if God is so good and so perfect, why is there so much suffering and hurt in the world? I'm not even sure where you want to start with this, Mike, but yeah, I'll just throw it over to you and kind of give the ball in your court.
Hey Toy, thanks for having me on. Of course, you're right. It's a big question. It's an interesting question. It's one I've pretty much dealt with the minute I got saved till now. I've always been wrestling with this question. I've been asked multiple times. I've written quite a lot on it. There's lots out there in the world. It's one of the most debated questions just out in the world. But I think we should start by questioning the question.
Yeah.
It says, why there's a good and perfect God, or how can he exist if there's suffering? And that obviously poses two predicates that the question supposes are opposite, right? And one has to be true. It's either God's not good and there's evil, or there needs to be no evil because he's good, and those are the only two binaries, and that's obviously not true. These are akin to the kind of questions I used to ask when I was coming to faith when I was young, where I thought God had to be this, and if he was this, there couldn't be that. And as you grow up, you realize there's just more to the story than that. The first thing is to consider where evil comes from. We know that evil comes and came typically from the fall, as we understand it. Of course, you had the devil that was cast out before we fell, and that's something we can tease out at another time. But Thessalonians and other books in the Bible help us tease out the devil or Satan or the evil one's journey. So evil definitely existed conceptually, but we came to know evil as God's creation after the fall. After the fall, and we learned that we join Adam and Eve in rebellion. After the fall, by virtue of the original sin, that's often called in different texts, human beings are born with the tendency towards evil, and we have then the ability to cause suffering in the lives of other people. The intent in our heart, our natural heart, is evil. We learn this in Genesis 8:21. This is where evil comes from in the first sense. Now, because of, we had Eden, which was perfect, which was pure, which was then destroyed because of one man's action, and that man was essentially the best of us. That's how to think about Adam. Adam was the best of us. And, people often say, if it was me, I wouldn't have had it. And you go, well, since you've been born, you've been rebelling against God, so you've had ample practice at being rebellious, right? So because Adam fell, that proclivity now exists in every man's heart. Now, and I say this, reticent, but also quite confident that a lot of the suffering that we experience on earth is caused by other people. What I mean by that is it may not be directly caused by somebody, namely someone may not have come to your house and hit you or stolen your food, but because of the amount of people we have, because human beings have ventured into pretty much every corner of the earth, and the ecological pressures now of being on the earth is growing as the number of people on the earth grow. A lot of our pain, a lot of our pressure, a lot of the problems in the world, whether it be climate change or it be politics or it be economic, it all stems from other people. So we cause suffering to each other. Bear in mind, we've got a proclivity in our hearts to cause suffering. We cause suffering when we meet and we interact with each other. So if God was to get rid of suffering, he would have to get rid of the cause, right? Yeah. And the cause is who? Us. So God would essentially have to get rid of every single human being if he's to get rid of suffering. Or worse still, he would have to eradicate free will as we know it. Imagine if no action you took could lead to harm. You wouldn't be. You couldn't be allowed to take any action whatsoever. Now, Because suffering, unfortunately, comes with the fall, and quite frankly is kind of embedded into how we do human life together. What God in his infinite mercy does is he goes, since you will suffer, how do I ensure that suffering isn't wasted? And this is the lovely thing about God. This is where his intellect and his foreknowledge comes in. Because God, knowing that you will do and you will make decisions that may lead to someone else suffering, he takes it and he uses it. And the first way he uses it is by helping you understand that when you suffer, the first way he uses it is by using suffering to help you understand that this is not your home. Earth is simply a place. You're a pilgrim here. You're a sojourner here. It helps you understand that earth is lovely, but you shouldn't get too attached because it is ultimately broken. This is the prayer the psalmist prayed in Psalms 39:4. Help me to remember to number my days, God, to remember that this is not my home. In Psalms 119:19, a similar cry goes out saying that, God, help me to realize that I am a foreigner here. In 1 Peter 1:17, the same sentiment is echoed. Help me to understand I am on earth as a temporary assignment. We are essentially on spiritual green cards. This is not our home, and suffering on this earth has the ability of making that very, very clear to us, that our final destination is not here. It's in heaven, a place where there will be no suffering. That's the first thing it does. The second thing it does is it actually helps us. Suffering, and the reason why God uses it is because it does, and it carries out a great work in us that nothing else can. You look at Israel. Israel often forgot God with blessing. When they suffered, they at least knew they had a hole. They knew there was some sort of gap, and that led them to pray, right? In James 1:2-4, we are told to count it all joy when we suffer, because when we meet trials, they bring various growth kind of points in us. One is that it produces steadfastness. The other is that it makes us perfect, complete, lacking in nothing. So suffering then actually produces good in the believer's life. It's not wasted, it produces good. When you're wrong, guess what you have to do? You have to forgive. When you pray for something that's not quite there and it's not coming as quickly as you'd like it to come, or guess what? You have to be patient. When your body starts to decay because of old age, guess what? It reminds you that this is only your temporary suit. At some stage, you will go back dust to dust. The third thing suffering does is that it's a powerful witness. You see, as a Christian, you have to suffer differently. That means when you go through the same process that other people in the world go through, you go through it with a different temperament. You come out of it joyful, your joy still intact. That's a powerful witness. When someone goes, I've got cancer, someone says, so have I. But the temperament of one of them is one of rejoicing, of gladness, of worship. That speaks volumes. So suffering is then a canvas upon which Christians can paint a very illustrious picture of God's glory and grace. One that appears very jarring to the unbeliever. They go, how can you go through so much but yet retain your joy? And you tell them it's because I've found a hope. So you see very quickly, it's not why does a good and perfect God allow suffering, but how God uses suffering, which we inflict to accomplish his glory, but somehow also fatten our joy. It's wonderful.
Thank you. And we had a conversation of here briefly, because a rebuttal I've often heard about that point of God using suffering is that a lot of people would say, well, if I had children, I wouldn't use suffering to teach them a lesson. And they would then say, well, God is the same, right? God is kind of like us. Why would God use suffering? Surely there's an easier alternative, that God is infinite wisdom and infinite knowledge. You could use that. Why? What is it about suffering that God chooses and says, this is the one way I want to use to teach these people? How is that fair that God uses that?
Well, it's not the one way he chooses to use it. God teaches us in all sorts of different ways. What he does is, suffering exists In Peter, I forget where in Peter, Jesus says, or the quote of Jesus is, and when you suffer, so and so. Suffering's to be expected by virtue of how we live, as I explained at the start. What God does is, rather than making suffering wasted, he ties it into his glorious story that he is telling, this cosmic story, this meta story that he's telling. That's what he does. It's not that he picks suffering and randomly makes us suffer. It's that he uses our relationships with each other, and you being betrayed by a friend, and you being stabbed in the back by somebody, and you having your stuff stolen. Somehow, rather than having that end there, he takes that thread and he weaves it into a much, much more elaborate and deeper story. So God is ensuring that nothing in your life is wasted. That's what's happening there. But the bigger issue with what you said is, one thing we often do as believers, and we have to really stamp it out, is we've got to stop comparing ourselves to God. We've got to stop comparing ourselves to God, our mums to God, our neighbors to God. They are not God. So when people make the argument and say, well, I wouldn't do this, so why would God? It's the ultimate insult to God, because what it does is it presupposes that something he doesn't, or somehow you've got some wisdom that God is somehow doesn't really understand, or again, it presupposes that God has this obligation to explain himself to you, as though he has to make sense to you. And this is the approach sometimes we have to the Bible, and we have to root out, because if we had that approach to the Bible, we will keep thinking of God as some sort of nice guy in the sky, or likening him to the best person we know on earth. But God is a cosmic entity. God is absolutely different to anything else we can even imagine, think, postulate. He is absolutely different. So we have to let the Bible teach us what we know about God, and we have to stop using human standards, which are broken, which are totally barren, to try and compare God, who is morally perfect. It's something that it feels like it makes sense, because we're using simple English, but when you consider the what you're dealing with, then you start to realize just how essentially flawed your comparison is, because God is just that different.
Yeah, thank you. And I think the reason I did bring up the question is because we see a lot. I think we all have tendencies to do it ourselves, and it's such a grievous disservice that we give to God, and it makes the topic of suffering that much harder to understand, where we think ultimately we can do a better job than God, which is essentially what we're saying, is that if I was God, I would do it differently. Or we try and make God man, and that's what we see in the very first sin that was committed in the Bible, is that Adam and Eve thought they could be better God than God himself. And there's a line he always uses all the time that I'm going to borrow quickly, is that we don't even know what's behind our head. Talk less of the God who spoke the cosmos into existence. Like, how can we try and understand him? And we're always going to reach a ceiling when we try and do that. When we try and go from our understanding of humanity to understand God, you're always going to fall short. So thank you for that, Mike. I really appreciate it, and thank you guys for listening as well. If you have any more questions, if you agree with us, disagree, please let us know, or send your question to hello@ourgodgivenmission.com. And also, don't forget to like this video, subscribe it, and share it. And as always, we'll see you next week.